Now in life, there aren't many certainties. Death, taxes, but for a comic book lover, there's one more. A relative handing you a big, dusty box of comics and saying, go see if these are worth something. But not every issue is going to be a pristine Action Comics #1 that goes for $3 million on eBay. It's going to be more along the lines of,
okay, maybe the thing is a fake.
That's why we're here at Vintage Phoenix in downtown Bloomington, where we're going to find out what's that stack of comics really worth. Today on Indi Android.
One thing that's pretty easy is that most of the comics that are brought in are worth very, very little.
This optimist is Matt Traughber, who's been with the store since the early 2000s and appraises between 5 and 10 comic collections a week. He's also right. Most of your comics aren't worth anything. But why?
Most of the comics we see are from the 80s or 90s to present, especially from the 90s speculation boom. Without getting into the whole history of comics, there was a massive speculation boom in the first half of the 90s.
Let's get into the whole history. From the mid-80s to the early 90s, big-name comics like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns were grabbing mainstream attention. On top of that, news kept breaking of old Golden Age comics like Action Comics #1 selling for thousands of dollars. So the notion of comics as collectibles grew.
People start buying into this collectability aspect, like they're automatically collectible, they're automatically valuable simply because they're comics, which is not true. The old ones are valuable because they're rare. And once most people are treating them as collectibles and keeping them and storing them, then it's the exact opposite of what it used to be. The supply is simply too plentiful.
The gold rush had started, but in this case, the mine was printing more gold than anyone actually asked for. Traditionally, a successful comic prints about 100,000 copies total. In the speculation boom, they were printing millions.
And the extreme example is that X-Men #1 by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. There are 8 million copies of that comic, and there's nothing that sells. In the last 20 years, there's been one or two comics that have sold 1 million copies, 1 million. So, you were selling 8 million copies of that. So it's supply and demand. There are so many copies of those books that for every person looking, there are, in some cases, thousands of copies.
For instance, let's take a look at The Death of Superman. This book was manufactured to be big, but now you can get a copy of Superman 75 sealed in that melodramatic black bag for around $15 on eBay.
6 months or a year ago, someone, as we've been talking about, came in the front door with a box of comics and took the lid off, and it was 160 copies of that issue. That's all it was. It's the old ones that you hear stories that are worth $1 million. It's because there's 10 copies in existence, not millions.
It's a bird!
It's a plane! It's a corpse. Come mid-November, Superman will be flying all right to heaven.
Okay, so the 90s kind of broke comic collecting. But what do you do if you really think you've got something special? When you bring in your collection to somebody like Matt, he'll look for a few things.
Anybody who's into comics knows some of the key issues. They're going to recognize them on the spot, but not all of them. I'll go through every single book, and make sure I'm not overlooking something. We had that recently with the collection I said we bought with a couple thousand comics. There's a long run of Hulk, a whole box full of Hulk comics. I wanted to double check I wasn't missing something, so I pulled out our price guide, and I'm looking for, just kind of in the column there, a spike, a number maybe that shoots up. And I found it, and I go across and read why, and it was the second appearance of Rocket Raccoon from the Guardians of the Galaxy. So that issue, the one before it, nothing, it's worth a couple bucks. The one after, a couple bucks. That issue's worth like $100. I both know what I'm looking for a lot of time, but I also know that I don't know it all.
Then, if he sees a few choice nuggets, there's more to consider. Condition. No one wants your Dark Knight Returns if it's been flavor blasted with nacho dust. The market. What sells well in this area? And lastly, what's the hype around it?
And there are comics that used to be worthless, and then something happens and a character catches on, and suddenly people want that again. It's a book like Marvel Superheroes Winter Special from 90-something. It's the first appearance of Squirrel Girl. But no one cared about that for about 20 years. It was in our bargain boxes if we had it, or all the comic shops. And then Squirrel Girl takes off and everyone's going through the boxes trying to find copies that haven't been destroyed by being in bargain boxes for 20 years.
If all of the above goes right, you might have a bona fide moneymaker on your hands. But again, the real diamonds in the rough have one big thing in common. There just aren't that many of them.
Yes, the supply is back down to normal, but there's plenty of it, basically. For for the number of active collectors, looking for anything, there's plenty of copies. It takes time, and frankly, modern comics are very unlikely to ever be worth the type of prices you see from, Action #1 or Detective 27 or Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of these key characters from the past. Primarily because there are so few copies of those comics that still exist, because comics were pretty much considered disposable entertainment. There were few collectors, but most were kids and people who just kind of read them, and not to mention with comics from the golden age, the 30s and 40s, you have things like paper drives during World War II that destroy some. You have the scare of people trying to say comics are corrupting youth, so some comics are burned, in the 50s. So you have things that really make some of those earlier 50s and earlier comics pretty rare.
So the comics you got in the 90s aren't worth anything, and the comics you buy today won't be worth anything. Then what's a comic collector to do? I don't know, man. Have fun. Enjoy them. That's what they're for.
I always tell people this. If your comics end up being worth, some great money, great. But you just got lucky. That's not what they're for. Comic books are entertainment. So you're guaranteed to get your money's worth if you're buying them and reading them and enjoying them. So where should you start if you want to be a collector? Start with something you're interested in. All you care about, though, you're just like, I don't want that. I want to collect. Then you're better off buying books that are already worth something. Buying some of these older books and watching them go up, because some of them have gone up tremendously. I tell people over and over, pick out something you've got some interest in. If you've never read a comic, we can steer you towards something, but I tell people to trust themselves. Like I'll ask you, what at least are you generally interested in, point you in that direction, and tell you the right one to start with is the one that looks cool to you.